In the decades leading up to World War II, the world's balance of power was shifting rapidly. In East Asia and the vast Pacific Ocean, a formidable new force was rising: Imperial Japan. Driven by a desire for resources, territory, and recognition as a global power, Japan embarked on an aggressive expansion that would soon threaten the fragile peace maintained by Western powers, particularly the United States. The seeds of conflict were sown in the early 1930s when Japan invaded Manchuria in northeast China. This act of aggression was condemned internationally but met with little effective resistance. Emboldened, Japan continued its march into China, igniting the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. Cities were bombed, civilians suffered, and atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre shocked the world. Japan's goal was clear: to establish a vast empire that could control the resources and strategic locations necessary for its survival and growth. This expansion alarmed the United States, which had deep economic and strategic interests in the Pacific region. American businesses traded extensively with China, and the Philippines, an American territory, was seen as a critical foothold in Asia. The U.S. government was wary of Japan's intentions but was constrained by strong isolationist sentiment among its citizens and policymakers. The horrors of World War I were still fresh, and many Americans were reluctant to become entangled in another distant war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, however, understood the growing danger. Although public opinion favored neutrality, Roosevelt began quietly preparing the nation for the possibility of conflict. He strengthened the military, increased funding for defense, and sought to build alliances with Britain and other nations resisting Axis aggression. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 was a key step, allowing the U.S. to provide arms and supplies to Allied nations without direct involvement in combat. Meanwhile, Japan continued to push southward, eyeing the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, rich in oil and rubber, became a primary target. Japan's expansion threatened to cut off vital supplies to the Allies and undermine American influence in the region. In response, the United States imposed a series of economic sanctions and embargoes aimed at curbing Japanese aggression. The most significant was the oil embargo of 1941, which severely limited Japan's access to vital fuel. Japan, heavily dependent on imports for its war machine, faced a dire choice: retreat and lose face or seize resources by force. Tensions escalated. Diplomatic talks between the US and Japan faltered, each side unwilling to make concessions. In Tokyo, hardliners within the Japanese military pushed for war, convinced that a swift, decisive strike could neutralize American power in the Pacific and secure Japan's dominance. On the American side, the government increased vigilance. Intelligence agencies intercepted communications suggesting an imminent attack, but the exact target remained uncertain. Some believed the Philippines or British territories might be struck first. The possibility of an attack on the U.S. mainland seemed remote to many. Meanwhile, Roosevelt sought to rally the American people, preparing them mentally and emotionally for the potential sacrifices ahead. His speeches emphasized the importance of unity, preparedness, and the defense of freedom. Yet, the nation remained deeply divided on the issue of war. This tension culminated in the fateful morning of December 7, 1941. Without warning, hundreds of Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The assault was devastating. Battleships were sunk or damaged, thousands of Americans were killed, and the Pacific Fleet was temporarily crippled. The Day of Infamy, as Roosevelt called it, shattered America's isolation and thrust the nation into global conflict. The attack united the American people in shock and outrage. Congress swiftly declared war on Japan, marking the official entry of the United States into World War II. In the days that followed, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S., expanding the conflict further. Yet, even as America mobilized for war, the Pacific challenge loomed large. Japan's empire was vast, its military entrenched across countless islands and territories. The US faced the daunting task of projecting power across thousands of miles of ocean to confront a determined enemy. The stage was set for a brutal and complex campaign that would test American resolve and ingenuity. In the months after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt and his military commanders began planning the strategy that would guide America's fight in the Pacific. Recognizing the futility of attempting to capture every Japanese-held island, they devised a plan to leapfrog across strategically important locations, cutting off and isolating enemy strongholds. This approach, known as island hopping, would become the backbone of America's Pacific campaign. But before that, the United States had to transform itself. Factories shifted from peacetime production to war production, churning out ships, planes, tanks, and weapons at an unprecedented pace. Millions of men were drafted into military service, while women and minorities found new opportunities in the workforce, forever changing American society. The alliance with Britain and the Soviet Union formed a global front against the Axis powers, but the Pacific War remained a separate and uniquely challenging theater. The vast distances, harsh climates, and fierce Japanese resistance created obstacles unlike those faced in Europe. As 1942 began, the United States stood at a crossroads. The Pacific challenge was immense, but the nation's spirit was unbroken. With determination, innovation, and sacrifice, America prepared to meet the test and turn the tide of war in its favor. From isolation to arsenal, America mobilizes for war in the Pacific. The shock of Pearl Harbor changed everything. Before December 7, 1941, the United States had been a nation torn between its traditional policy of isolation and the creeping realization that global conflict was inevitable. But the surprise Japanese attack shattered any illusions of safety, thrusting the nation into total war. In the days following the attack, America's industries, government, and citizens mobilized with unprecedented speed and unity. Factories that once produced automobiles, appliances, and consumer goods were quickly converted to manufacture tanks, airplanes, warships, and ammunition. The sheer scale of this transformation was staggering. Production surged so rapidly that by 1943, the United States was producing more war material than all the Axis powers combined. This industrial boom wasn't just about making machines, it represented the mobilization of an entire society. Millions of men enlisted or were drafted into the armed forces, training rigorously for the battles ahead. Women stepped into roles traditionally held by men, working in factories and shipyards, keeping the wheels of war turning while also challenging the social norms of the time. The military itself expanded and adapted. Recognizing the unique challenges of the Pacific theater, where vast distances and island warfare dominated, the Navy and Marine Corps grew dramatically. Aircraft carriers became the centerpiece of naval power, replacing the battleship as the decisive weapon at sea. Planes like the F-6F Hellcat and the B-29 Superfortress were developed for long-range strikes and bombing campaigns. On the home front, propaganda campaigns fostered a spirit of unity and sacrifice. Every citizen was encouraged to contribute, whether through rationing food and fuel, buying war bonds, or volunteering for civil defense. The idea that everyone had a role to play became central to the American war effort. Diplomatically, the U.S. worked closely with its allies. The relationship with Britain deepened, with shared strategies and coordinated attacks across multiple fronts. The Soviet Union, engaged heavily in Europe against Germany, also indirectly relieved pressure on the Allies. The U.S. military leadership coordinated global resources and forces, positioning America as the leading power in the Allied coalition. In the Pacific, early battles tested American resolve and strategy. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 marked a turning point. A smaller U.S. force managed to surprise and decisively defeat a larger Japanese fleet, sinking 4 aircraft carriers and shifting naval superiority to the Allies. This victory was crucial. It halted Japan's expansion and gave the U.S. momentum. Following Midway, the island-hopping campaign officially began. Instead of attacking every island defended by Japan, American forces targeted specific strategic locations to establish bases for air and naval operations. This strategy minimized casualties and maximized efficiency, as bypassed Japanese garrisons were cut off and rendered ineffective. Guadalcanal was the first major offensive in this campaign. Fierce fighting in dense jungles and difficult terrain tested American troops, many of whom were inexperienced. The battle was brutal and prolonged, but its success marked the beginning of a steady push toward Japan. The island-hopping strategy required immense coordination between the Navy, Army, and Marine Corps. Logistics were a constant challenge, supplying troops over thousands of miles of ocean, building airfields in hostile environments, and maintaining equipment under tropical conditions. Each victory provided a stepping stone, but also demanded tremendous sacrifice. Meanwhile, American scientists and engineers worked tirelessly to develop new technologies to gain an edge. Innovations in radar, sonar, cryptography, and medicine improved battlefield effectiveness. The breaking of Japanese codes gave U.S. commanders critical intelligence, allowing them to anticipate enemy movements and plan operations with greater precision. By 1943, the scale of American military production was staggering. Factories churned out thousands of aircraft, warships, and vehicles every month. The economy boomed despite the sacrifices, with unemployment virtually eliminated. This industrial might was the backbone of America's ability to sustain a long, multi-front war. Socially, the war began to transform the country. African Americans and other minority groups pushed for greater participation in the military and workforce, leading to gradual but significant changes. The war effort created opportunities but also exposed inequalities, planting seeds for future civil rights movements. As the island-hopping campaign progressed, battles at places like Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu demonstrated the fierce Japanese determination to defend their territory. Casualties were high, and the fighting was often hand-to-hand and brutal. Yet, American forces adapted, improving amphibious assault tactics and integrating air and naval firepower effectively. Each victory brought the United States closer to Japan's home islands. The campaign wasn't just military, it was psychological. With every island captured, Japanese forces were isolated and demoralized, their supply lines cut and hope dwindling. Despite the enormous cost, the U.S. war machine proved relentless. The industrial power, combined with strategic innovation and sheer willpower, made victory in the Pacific seem increasingly inevitable. The turning tide, hard-fought battles and strategic advances in the Pacific. As 1943 unfolded, the momentum in the Pacific began to shift decidedly in favor of the Allies. The United States, having fully embraced its role as a global superpower, was now transitioning from defensive operations to a relentless offensive aimed squarely at Japan's heart. The island-hopping campaign had begun to unravel the Japanese defensive perimeter, but the cost was steep and the challenges immense. The early victories, such as the pivotal Battle of Midway, had crippled Japan's carrier fleet, yet the Japanese military remained fierce and resourceful. Their soldiers were deeply committed to defending every inch of territory, often fighting with a desperation born of cultural honor codes and orders to never surrender. This made every battle an intense test of will, courage, and military ingenuity. One of the first major tests of America's new offensive strategy came with the Battle of Guadalcanal, which had started in late 1942 and continued into early 1943. Guadalcanal was a critical strategic location in the Solomon Islands, offering a base to threaten Japanese supply lines and project Allied power deeper into the Pacific. The fighting there was grueling, dense jungle terrain, tropical diseases like malaria, and a tenacious enemy who launched repeated counterattacks. American Marines and soldiers endured harsh conditions and heavy casualties but ultimately prevailed, marking a turning point in the Pacific War. Following Guadalcanal, the U.S. military focused on capturing key islands to establish forward bases for air operations. These islands served as springboards for bombing raids and naval patrols, tightening the noose around Japan. The capture of the Gilbert Islands, particularly Tarawa in late 1943, was an example of the brutal nature of the fighting. The Japanese defenders had fortified the island with concrete bunkers and artillery, forcing American forces to conduct some of the bloodiest amphibious assaults of the war. Lessons learned from Tarawa influenced later assaults, leading to improved coordination between naval bombardments, airstrikes, and ground troops. In early 1944, the campaign pressed onward with the seizure of the Marshall Islands, further isolating Japanese garrisons and expanding the Allied reach. The capturing of airfields in the Marshalls allowed American bombers to strike deeper into enemy-held territory, including the Mariana Islands, which were crucial for the eventual bombing campaigns against the Japanese mainland. The fall of Saipan in mid-1944 was particularly significant. Saipan was not just a military objective, its capture brought American forces within bomber range of Tokyo. The battle was fierce, with Japanese soldiers fighting to the last man and civilians tragically caught in the crossfire. The victory at Saipan led directly to the resignation of Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, signaling the psychological impact of the U.S. advance on Japanese leadership. At the same time, the U.S. Navy and Marines faced some of their most brutal combat at Peleliu and later Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These battles were characterized by rugged terrain, entrenched defenders, and kamikaze attacks that tested American endurance and tactics. The ferocity of these engagements underscored the high stakes and foreshadowed the immense costs that an invasion of Japan's home islands would entail. Amidst these military operations, American intelligence played a vital role. Codebreakers at Magic and Ultra cracked Japanese communication codes, providing commanders with invaluable insights into enemy plans and movements. This intelligence advantage allowed the U.S. to anticipate Japanese strategies and avoid potential ambushes, turning the tide in numerous encounters. Technological innovation continued to shape the war effort. The development of long-range bombers like the B-29 Superfortress enabled the U.S. to conduct strategic bombing raids on Japanese industrial centers. These raids, while controversial due to their devastating impact on civilians, aimed to cripple Japan's capacity to sustain the war. Throughout the campaign, the logistical challenge of supplying troops across thousands of miles of ocean was enormous. American ingenuity and industrial might met this challenge with innovations in amphibious warfare, naval logistics, and air transport. The coordination between the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps improved dramatically, showcasing the effectiveness of joint operations. Socially and politically, the prolonged conflict began to affect American morale and politics. While initial unity remained strong, the human cost of war, thousands of casualties and missing soldiers, created pressure on leaders to find a swift end to the fighting. Meanwhile, the success of minority groups in contributing to the war effort started to shift social dynamics back home, planting seeds for future civil rights movements. By late 1944, the Allies had pierced the defensive ring around Japan. The war in the Pacific had transformed from a defensive struggle to a relentless offensive, pushing ever closer to the Japanese mainland. But the ultimate challenge remained: how to force Japan's surrender without the catastrophic losses expected from a full-scale invasion. The stage was set for the final, decisive phases of the war, phases that would involve new weapons, tragic decisions, and historic consequences that reshaped the world forever. The final push, the end game in the Pacific, and the dawn of a new era. By early 1945, after years of grueling island battles and relentless advances, the Allied forces stood on the doorstep of Japan's home islands. The brutal campaign had pushed American troops across the vast Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, but the war was far from over. The Japanese military's fierce resistance, coupled with the looming threat of a devastating invasion, meant that victory would come at an enormous cost. The Battle of Okinawa, fought between April and June 1945, was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater. Okinawa's capture was essential as it offered a strategic base for staging an invasion of mainland Japan. The battle showcased the fierce determination of Japanese defenders, who employed kamikaze suicide attacks against Allied ships and fought relentlessly in fortified positions. The brutal fighting resulted in tens of thousands of casualties on both sides, including significant civilian deaths. For many Americans, Okinawa was a grim preview of what an invasion of Japan's home islands might entail. Faced with the prospect of a prolonged and bloody invasion, American military and political leaders sought alternatives that could force a Japanese surrender. At the same time, the Manhattan Project, America's secret program to develop an atomic bomb, was reaching its climax. Scientists had succeeded in harnessing nuclear fission, creating a weapon of unimaginable destructive power. On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, instantly killing tens of thousands of people and obliterating much of the city. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, causing similar devastation. These bombings shocked the world and demonstrated the horrifying capabilities of nuclear weapons. The combination of overwhelming military pressure and the unprecedented devastation wrought by the atomic bombs pushed the Japanese government to reconsider its position. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a historic radio broadcast, ending World War II. This announcement came after years of hardship, suffering, and sacrifice that had reshaped the entire world. Japan's surrender marked the beginning of a new era. The Allied occupation led by General Douglas MacArthur oversaw Japan's demilitarization, democratization, and reconstruction. Meanwhile, the world grappled with the implications of nuclear warfare and the shifting balance of global power. For the United States, the Pacific War had transformed the nation. From a reluctant participant, America emerged as a dominant military and economic superpower. The war accelerated technological advancements, social changes, and set the stage for the Cold War. It also left a legacy of valor, sacrifice, and lessons learned about the costs of global conflict. The Pacific Campaign, with its island-hopping strategy, fierce battles, and ultimate use of atomic weapons, stands as one of the most dramatic and consequential chapters in human history. It reshaped international relations, redefined military strategy, and forever altered the lives of millions.